Good morning. So I decided that it was a good stopping point before pulling the engine last night, and I really needed a shower and to clean up and stuff. So I am ready to go this morning now. We're going to pull this engine, but a couple things. When you stop work for the night, always put away all your tools, and it's actually a good idea to do that every few hours if you're working on something really long anyway. And the reason is because if you do this for the first time, you're going to spend more time looking for where you left that ratchet or where you left that 10mm socket, because it's not going to be in your toolbox or on the floor. And then after looking for 20 minutes, you realize, oh, the extension is in the spark plug hole because I was loosening the spark plugs and I left it there to remind myself to tighten them later. But of course you forget. So it's always a good idea to stop, put everything away to make sure you don't leave any tools in the engine or lose them and stuff. You guys who have done this before know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you spend an hour looking for your 15mm socket. So that's a real good idea. The other thing is I want to talk about this crane just for a second here. So these are actually surprisingly inexpensive, and this is kind of a cool Goodyear racing one here. But you can get these for under $200, actually under $150. And you can also rent them from a lot of auto parts stores and stuff. But they fold up. They don't take too much space. They only take up about as much square footage as maybe a trash can or something when you fold them up. So if you're going to do this as a hobby, it's a good investment to have a good one of these. One of the things, if you've never used these before, a big mistake a lot of people make is there's a little lever here that when you tighten the lever, people think that because there's a big 500-pound engine on it, you've got to really tighten that lever. Don't do that. When you lower the crane, just go ahead and lower it, and then to stop it, as soon as it stops, don't even hand tighten it. Just when it stops, it's stopped. But if you over tighten this lever, you're going to break the seal in there, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. So just as soon as the crane stops, you're done. Don't even hand tighten it. Just let it where it is. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and hook this thing up to the engine and go ahead and pull this thing out of here. All right, and again, this is definitely one of those things that's easier with two people. But what I've got here is a chain, and normally in the salvage yard you would use like a seat belt is really good for this. Just tie one to one of the intake runners and another to one of the exhaust manifold runners, and you can just pull it out. I do have a leveling mechanism that I'm going to use when I install the engine, but when you pull the engine, I find that the leveling mechanism really isn't all that necessary. So what I've got is a chain tied between the two lifting brackets, and on this model I'll go ahead and show you what you're looking for because lots of engines have these. So these hooks here are your lifting brackets. You'll find a lot of engines have these hooks or loops that are for this purpose. And we've got another one on the other side of the engine right over there. And again, I'm using just a chain between these that I'm going to go ahead and hook up onto my crane. And at this point, you want to really pay attention that the chain isn't hooked over something that's going to break. For example, I've got a positive crankcase valve right here, and if the chain is underneath that, it's going to break it right off. So you really want to double check and make sure that nothing's going to be bound up by the chain. And I think we're good to go. So at this point, I've got all of the engine mounts undone. I've got all of the engine to transmission bolts out. And I'm going to take one last look around the engine, make sure there's no connections that I may have forgot about. But trust me, normally you will start pulling the engine, and if you feel any resistance at all, don't try to force through it. Stop, check and see what's binding, and a lot of times you'll find there's like a ground strap, or a lot of times a transmission cooling, oil cooling line is connected to the engine that you missed or something. So you're always looking for stuff like that. So I think we're good to go. Let's go ahead and give it a try. All right, so the trick here is to just lift up until you just get tension on the chain, and then again recheck that nothing's binding, and take the weight off the engine mounts. And then as soon as you got the weight off the engine mounts, you just kind of want to rock this thing to separate it off of the transmission. And I'm looking for the little studs, the little alignment dowels. There's one right there, and I'll show you what we're looking for here. All right, so what I'm looking at is right here, and you can see there's what looks like a bolt through there, but that's actually just an alignment dowel. Very important to take note of whether the dowel sticks in the engine block or whether it sticks with the transmission bell housing, because when you swap the new engine in, it may not be in that same orientation. You may have it where when I pull this engine, both of these, there's going to be two dowels. Both of these dowels are stuck in the transmission, but then when I swap the new engine, I don't notice that the two dowels are stuck in the engine block. So I would have to remove those then. So make sure you take note of that. That's really important. And what you can do is just very gently, you don't want to force anything here and certainly not crack the bell housing. You can put a pry bar in there and just gently separate. Now you can see I'm free off of that alignment dowel. So now I can continue to lift the engine up. And again, the trick is to go 1 or 2 pumps of the handle. You can see maybe the engine's lifting up now. 1 or 2 pumps of the handle, stop, recheck everything. If you feel anything resisting, God forbid you see the car is actually lifting up, by all means, stop what you're doing, lower the engine a little bit, check where the bind is. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look and see how my progress is right now. And this looks real good. I would like to show you this. All right, so what we're looking at right here, you can actually see the drive plate, and it looks like we do have some clearance enough from our bell housing here. And if we look behind that drive plate, you probably won't be able to see it, but if we look behind the drive plate towards the transmission, you can see the torque converter. We want to make sure that torque converter stays in place. Remember, I do have a jack under this transmission, so when I pull this out, the transmission doesn't fall, possibly drop out that torque converter. We'll talk about the torque converter when we get this engine out of here, but it does look like that's going to be able to come out. Now, if you find you can't get to this position here and get that flywheel or that drive plate free, then you need to check at the front of the engine and see if you've got clearance. And I can look right now, and I do not have much clearance at all. So if I look back at the front of the engine, this pulley here is dangerously close to jamming up. So I'm going to pay really close attention to that. And if the engine binds up, I'm going to probably have to take this pulley off. That would mean I'd have to unfortunately lower the engine again, and because I won't be able to access the bolts to get this pulley off. I think I'm going to be able to clear it just fine, but you got to remember on the reinstallation, having just a millimeter to work like that, it might be better to just go ahead and remove this pulley when I get the engine out and then reinstall it after the engine is back in. So those are the things you want to look for. And again, I'm not going to totally conclude if the engine jams up that it's because of this. There could also be something underneath the engine, maybe another engine mount that I missed. I doubt that now because it's raised up pretty high, but you're always on the lookout for stuff like that. So let's keep an eye on that and get back to lifting this engine out. And again, just repeating 1 or 2 pulls and checking that we're free here. That looks really good, nice and free, so we'll just go back and keep doing this back and forth. All right, we're getting there. One of the things you really want to be careful of, I want to check along the firewall. Very common to get caught up on different lines like the heater core or something like that. Looks like I've got pretty much everything clear, but you really want to check on that. Again, if you feel any resistance at all, stop, see what the problem is. But right now, I think looks like we've got a clear shot, so I'm going to go ahead and get this thing out of here. All right, as you can see, we're just about there, but you also want to keep an eye on the shaft on the pump here. Most of these models, there will be a red mark, and once you're at that red mark, that's as high as you can go. So if you need any more clearance, you just have to lower the car. But I think we're going to be able to make it here. Also, don't forget to check above you in your garage. Make sure you're not hitting the garage door railings or anything like that. And I think we are good to go. That should do it. All right, and what we're going to do is remove this drive plate. Now, normally these bolts fit in a specific pattern, so the drive plate only fits on one way. I'm not totally sure about that, so I'm just going to draw a paint line because there's going to be a little retaining disc here when I remove these bolts. This way I will know not only how this all lines up, but again, that retaining disc, is it going to be facing this way or this way? So I know that the paint mark is going to face out. Same thing with my flywheel, although that shouldn't be a problem with the flywheel or drive plate. So now that I've got that alignment mark on there, I can confidently take out these 6 bolts and remove the drive plate assembly with the retaining ring. And again, I'm going to remove this with a impact gun. I try to use impact guns sparingly. I don't mind removing stuff with it, but putting stuff back on, that's usually a different story. A couple ways if you don't have an impact gun, and when you tighten these up, it's not going to be possible to use an impact gun anyway because there's a specific torque setting for these. And incidentally, a lot of times they also use a red Loctite as well, so keep that in mind. But if you need to remove this, when I turn these nuts, the whole crank and drive plate is going to turn. You can use a ratchet on the front of the engine and hold the crankshaft bolt in place, and that way you can lock the crankshaft so you can remove these. All right, and on removing this last one, you can see there's this retaining ring, and now you see why I made the paint mark. So when I put this all back together, I know the retaining ring goes like that. And actually, well, that's interesting. On this model, these bolt holes are evenly spaced, so I'm really glad that I did that, because on most models, the retaining ring will only fit all the bolt hole patterns one way, but this model, they don't. So that way I retain my balance. The other thing is, does the plate go this way or this way? Right now, I know it goes this way, but again, if you're doing an engine rebuild 2.5 months from now, are you going to remember? Now I will, because of my paint mark. All right, when you take this off, take it off real slow, because usually there's another retaining plate behind this, and I don't think there's one on this model. Well, yes there is. So there's another retaining plate on this model behind it. Now that one, I'm going to mark the relationship as well. I can't make the relationship mark to anything on the engine or the crankshaft, because remember, we're replacing this engine. So I'm going to run and get some paint, and I'm going to make a mark on this retaining plate so that I know its direction as well, and also which side faces out. It looks to me like that could go either way, so maybe it doesn't matter, but I want to make sure I put it back exactly like it came. So again, pays to go slowly here. All right, and there we go. That's your rear main seal. You can see if a rear main seal is leaking, there's no way to repair it other than to separate the engine and transmission. All right, rear cover is off, and I'm also seeing I've got an alignment dowel here and an alignment dowel here. So I want to make sure on my replacement engine that the alignment dowels are in the engine and not in the transmission. Otherwise, obviously, it's not going to line up correctly. So at this point, I can go ahead and get this thing into an engine stand. And there are 2 ways to get the engine onto the engine stand. One is to get this engine stand into position and then lower the engine so that the bell housing bolt holes line up with your engine stand bolt holes. But I find it a lot easier to actually take the engine stand apart and just go ahead and bolt this up to the engine while it's on the hoist. And at least that works better for me. And again, these are grade 8 bolts that I got for this purpose of securing the engine to the engine stand. Don't use anything less than grade 8 bolts, because again, you're often going to be rotating and turning the engine, so you're bending those bolts back and forth a little bit, and if they fail, then you're going to be going to the emergency room when this falls on your foot, right? And typically when I go ahead and assemble this up, I usually like to put washers between the housing here, between the block and the engine mount, just to kind of protect that surface a little bit. But because this engine is completely destroyed, by the way, I'm going to show you that, obviously. I'm not really too worried about it, so I'm just going to go ahead and bolt these up as it is without little protective washers, but probably not a bad idea to put the washers in there on your new engine. All right, that is that. So I've got my engine that I've pulled here, and this is the engine that's going in. So what I want to do is swap any parts as necessary from either engine so that I have all my accessories all lined up before I install it. Obviously, any labels, like I noticed there's a label on this engine, I'm going to have to transfer that over to the new engine, so I'm going to be very careful about that. As far as reassembly, there's really nothing eventful about it. I'm going to show you one trick when I get to the reassembly that I think helps, but other than that, it's pretty much the reverse of everything you took off. You just want to make sure that you do your reassembly in order so that you don't block yourself from accessing some part. If I put the alternator on, am I going to be able to then put the power steering pump on? Shouldn't the power steering pump go on first? That kind of thing. So I think you get the gist of it. But before we get to that point, because I'm also kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to show the installation except for just a couple of things that might be helpful to you. And then, of course, hopefully I'll remember to show the startup if I have time and how you safely go about doing startup. But I think if you're like me, you're probably dying to see what's inside this engine. So let's go ahead and take this apart and see what's going on. All right, I expect this to be kind of the antithesis of the previous video where I inspected a good engine. All right, so right off the bat, once again, like in the previous video, there's a booger here, but these boogers are definitely metal. Right there, those are not from excess gasket material like in the previous video, so right there. That's a major concern. And then this pretty much settles it right here. Let's see if you can see this. All that in the bottom of the pan is all metal shavings right there. So clearly there is a severe issue with this engine. So let's go ahead and see what it is. It sounded like a rod knock when I actually heard the engine. And again, I wish I could have played that for you, but again, the battery was totally dead on this thing. So what I'm going to do is similar to the previous video. I'm going to go ahead and feel for play in these bearings, and actually that one feels good and that one feels good, so it's not 2 or 3. Let's go ahead and turn this crankshaft over and check 1 and 4 and see if those are bad. All right, and I'll tell you, this engine does not nearly crank over as easy as the one I'm going to replace it with, which is a good sign. So let's reach under here. That one feels good. And oh, look at that. All right, that is super loose. So that is the cause of this problem. And actually, I just noticed, because I just heard something break, the rod cap nut is actually missing on it here. Check that out. How interesting. I've never seen that before. So there's no nut for that rod cap, and it just ate up the bearing. I wonder if that rod cap nut is in the oil pan somewhere. I don't see it. I don't know what happened to it. Well, that's interesting. That's a little hard to explain, but let's go ahead and get that other rod cap nut off and inspect the damage a little further. Fascinating. I have to admit, this is really weird because I've never seen this before, and it doesn't look like it was broken off or anything. The threads look really good, so I'm not sure how that nut came off. Again, this is a really old oh wow, that just came off without me even trying. Almost like it was hand tight. I wonder if that's the situation with these other ones. Nope, that feels good. And that one's really tight. That really was just only finger tight. So, fascinating. All right, let's go ahead and get that off there. Maybe this engine is salvageable. I doubt it because there's so much metal in there. Come on. All right, that rod cap is really refusing to come off. So, man, it is really jammed on there. All right, I think I got it there. And let's see. Well, interestingly enough, the back of this cap is not hugely damaged. And this is what is remaining of the bearings here. So it spun the bearing. The bearing actually spun and overlapped over the other one. And this piston cannot be saved because I can see that because of the spun bearing, this journal is completely destroyed. All right, let's get a closer look at that, see if we can move this piston down. And all of this flaky stuff is what remains of the bearing. That is not supposed to happen. And that journal is completely destroyed right there. So that is what the problem was with this engine. I can't really explain that, but I don't think I would try to salvage this engine, to be honest with you. So anyway, let's get back because I've got running out of time really bad here, and I've got to install the next engine. So that's pretty cool. All right, so real quick, because I've got to wind down because I do have to get this thing finished in a few hours. So one of the things you want to do is rotate your torque converter, make sure that that is working fine and that it's set all the way back, which I can feel it is. If the torque converter, if you're not sure, the torque converter is going to have 3 stops, and unfortunately I don't really have time to show you the installation of a torque converter, but when you take a torque converter out, when you push it back onto the input shaft, it's going to stop, and then you kind of have to wiggle it around, spin it. It's going to stop again, and then when you turn it and wiggle it again, it's going to really set in. And I can just tell by looking at it because there's a couple inches depth between the edge of the bell housing and the torque converter, and I also can't reach my fingers behind it. This torque converter is set in all the way. It is absolutely critical that you have that torque converter set in all the way. I suggest trying to find a video of it. I unfortunately won't be able to have time to do it, but it is critical that that torque converter be set back all the way before you reassemble your new engine. The other thing I'm going to do is these hoses that are just kind of laying around, I'm going to go ahead and get these out of the way and probably use some wire ties to secure them out of the way, but you don't want stuff like that laying around because they'll get pinched under the new engine and damaged. So you're always looking for stuff like that. And the other thing I like to do is cover up this exhaust pipe with a paper bag so nothing gets in it. I also look for my fuel line, like my fuel line right here, and I'm going to cover that with plastic so no water gets in it or anything like that, to no boogers that might damage the fuel injector. So set that out of the way and I'll cover that. I also usually cover this torque converter with like a trash bag or something. And then I'll go through and I'll power wash this whole engine bay so everything's nice and clean. And well, check it out here. It looks like I've got a wire here that I didn't put a label on. No idea where the hell that goes. I'll have to figure it out. So that's one of the things to prep, and then I'll show you another one real quick. and that is I like to clean off all my parts. You can use, oops, I want to make sure we keep that with it. You can use engine cleaner. That works just fine for this. I'm fortunate enough to have this parts cleaner. And incidentally, for those of you that are interested, this parts cleaner is indeed that $100 Harbor Freight parts cleaner that a lot of you have been Googling, but you see that it is only able to use a water-based cleaner. This is actually kerosene that I've got coming out here. I've actually modified the pump with a different model so that I know it can handle the kerosene, and then I also like this little spray brush that I have that really makes cleaning easier. So I really suggest cleaning all your parts. It's going to make the assembly go a lot easier and also keep your hands cleaner and everything. All right, well, I'm still kind of spinning over that bearing. Ha, get it? What I'm going to do now is transfer over the parts from the bad engine to the good engine that I am going to require to complete this install. I'm going to say goodbye for now. Stay on because I'm going to show you a couple tips for the install, and maybe we'll go ahead and show the startup real quick if I get a chance to.